Okay, hello and welcome to everybody to this, I think, penultimate Mass Manchester webinar for this series on virtual and digital spaces and sonics and geographies and music, etc., etc. Very proud and very honoured to welcome Philip Kirby today from King's College London. Philip has previously worked at University of Oxford, Exeter and at the Sutton Trust, and he did his PhD in human geography at Royal Holloway in the University of London. His work, obviously I'll talk about his work in terms of music and digital geographies in a moment, but he's also working on the history and the social understandings of specific learning difficulties, particularly dyslexia and dyspraxia. And he has co-authored a book with Margaret Snowling called Dyslexia, A History, and that's due out in, I believe, November 2022. So looking forward to that. And obviously today Phil's here to talk about his work on the sort of geographies of film and geographies of film music. So he has papers in press, paper in press for the journal Geopolitics called Musical Geopolitics, Masculinity, Nationhood and the Scoring of Superman. So they're covering Superman there. I believe he worked on Wonder Woman as well, Philip. And he's also published in Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers on the geography of film music, musicology, gender, and the spatiality of instrumental music, which was a paper I read and I found utterly fascinating, and hence I suggested Phil for our webinar series. So today, Phil's going to be talking about video game scoring and the intersection of digital and musical geographies. So thank you for doing this, Phil, and over to you.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for turning up. Human geography is undergoing something of a digital turn in recent years as the technical provision, internet networks, connection speeds, wireless infrastructure, and societal demand via social media, online shopping, video gaming, the digital services have expanded. So too has geographical attention to the virtual. Digital geographies are now a key interest of the discipline, and a wide-ranging one, traversing topics from the feminist geographies of geographic information systems to urban redevelopment and computer-generated imagery. In keeping with human geography's perennial interest in popular culture, one of the digital turn's central concerns has been video games, that is, games played in virtual space via smartphones, home computers, and dedicated games consoles. This attention is timely. In terms of worldwide sales, the vast and ever-growing video game industry is now competitive with the film industry. The largest video game franchises now exceed the revenues of the largest film franchises. As of 2020, there are over 2.5 billion gamers around the world, with the largest markets in the developed economies of the West: United States, Germany, UK, France, and East Asia, China, Japan, and South Korea. In human geography, there have been two main theoretical approaches to video games, sometimes overlapping. The first is considered video games' representational strategies in politics, how video games portray the world and the ethicality of such portrayals. The majority of these accounts come from political geography, considering video games' representation of geopolitical conflict and violence. The second, seeing representational approaches as poorly placed to capture the contingency of the digital world and the embodied interactions between game and gamer, have favored non-representational theories, NRT. In these, video games are considered less for what they depict, more for how they connect the human and non-human. Missing from both approaches, however, is an element of video games that would seem important to each, which is music. Like video games themselves, video game scores are rapidly expanding in popularity. While early scores were often primitive, contemporary scores are now commissioned from leading Hollywood composers, such as Danny Elfman in the theme for Fable, Hans Zimmer in the music for Modern Warfare 2, and Bear McCreary in the game God of War. The majority of these scores are instrumental, non-diegetic, i.e. for the listener, they exist outside of the game world, well-developed and heavily influenced by Western musical conventions. Like film and television music, video game scores increasingly feature in the repertoires of leading international symphony orchestras and garner millions of listeners on streaming platforms like Spotify. In this paper, I argue that video game scores are more than an accompaniment to their on-screen component. Rather, as a socio-spatial ordering device that orients the player in virtual space, music is a key element of video games' representational worlds and geographical imaginations. And it achieves this by engaging with historical musical conventions that suggest, if not prescribe, how the music is to be understood by audiences. In this way, score is key to representational accounts of video games, providing geographical information in addition to video games' visual element. Moreover, as a medium that is commonly considered to affect beneath the level of conscious awareness, music is directly relevant to non-representational geographies, in which notions of affectivity and the precognitive are foregrounded. Beyond this, the analysis of video game score offers new ways of understanding music in geography. Traditionally, musical geographies are considered lyrical rather than instrumental music. When non-lyrical music has been considered, this has generally been in highly innovative but often abstract non-representational accounts, wherein music is frequently rendered indeterminate and elusive. To maintain this position, such accounts have largely omitted reference to work from the field of musicology and elsewhere that has delineated the ways in which instrumental music communicates spatial knowledge in structured ways akin but not identical to language. Here I seek to fill this conceptual gap using the analysis of video game score to contribute to emerging geographical work on instrumental music's style, structure, and form. To illustrate these theoretical debates, this paper provides a detailed case study of the score of The Legend of Zelda, a multi-video game series produced by the Japanese company Nintendo. Created in 1986 with the eponymous entry, The Legend of Zelda, the series relays an epic, fantastical story of good versus evil, embodied by the characters of Princess Zelda and the series' chief antagonist, Ganon. Commonly, individual entries begin with a confrontation between the two, in which Ganon is triumphant, coming to rule over the game's feudal land of Hyrule. Zelda then recruits the series' playable hero, Link, who fights in locations across Hyrule to restore its moral balance. To date, there are 19 entries in the series, with the most recent, Link's Awakening, released in 2019. Before tackling this case study, though, I will briefly introduce geographical work on video games and on video game music in particular. In 2009, Shaw and Wolf issued what is conventionally considered the first manifesto for video game geographies. Theirs was not the first geographical article on video games, but it was one of the first to examine the worlds of video games themselves, rather than the economics or politics of the video game industry. Specifically, Shaw and Wolf argued that, I'm quoting, video games represent rich and expansive worlds which provide the player with a virtual milieu for a multitude of activities, often violent social worlds, complex political environments, deeply racialized landscapes, and hypersexualized sites. To traverse the representational non-representational divide, their article conceptualized video games in two different but overlapping ways. The first, worlds of representation, considered how video games are rooted in and in turn project social, sexual, and political norms. The second, worlds of affect, argued for attention to the virtual topographies that the gamer navigates, stressing the effective link between video game worlds and bodies. Following their intervention, a series of both representational and non-representational accounts of video games were published. Many of the former considered video games political geographies, including the relationships between the video game industry and Western militaries. Thus, Salter, drawing on works such as Dederian, Style and Power, critiqued the claims to geopolitical and tactical verisimilitude of many Western military-themed games, arguing that the fate of bodies on screen is sanitized, including the realities of war. Hughes sought to broaden accounts beyond military-themed games while retaining an interest in video games' constitutive role in global conflict. Examining the genre of the quest, Hughes argued that, despite there being no direct connection with Western military interventions, both contemporary geopolitics and digital quest games facilitate anticipatory viewing and transact the illusion of mastery over the model to wider domains. In other words, they adopted a God's eye geopolitical viewpoint. More recently, these accounts have been joined by video game geographies written from more explicitly non-representational perspectives. These have responded to Shaw and Wolf's claim that research on video games will grow stale if it remains concerned purely with the representational dimensions. Central here has been the work of James Ash, Applying diverse theories, including Martin Heidegger's concept of attunement and Bernard Stiegler's notion of retention, Ash unpacks the somatic and sensory skills involved in video game play and discusses how video game environments cultivate a sense of captivation. In 2015, Ash coined the term interface envelope to capture the connections between player and game, defined as localized foldings of space-time that work to shape human capacities to sense space and time. Video games, says Ash, offer a window through which to understand the multiple forms, logics, and possible futures of the digital interface. What is notable about this new body of work on video game geographies, though, is the widespread omission of video game sound and music. Where sound has been considered in video game geographies, this has generally been of a very particular type, by a very particular conceptualization. Largely, it has portrayed sound and music as unstructured. Thus, Ash, in the case of Call of Duty 4, considers the short stylized electric riff that is heard when reaching a new level. The effective resonance of sound and number adds to amplify and reinforce affect as it potentially becomes personalized into a feeling of success. Elsewhere, Ash, after the French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy, defines music as vibration, a material process of expansion, radiation, and transmission of sound waves. Still elsewhere, Ash, applying an object-oriented ontology to video game music, states that very loud music emanating from a stereo might cause a human listener to cover their ears or move away from the source of the sound, whereas a rock would be unperturbed by the same sound waves. But another way non-representational geographies of the video game have considered shorter, rather than more developed acoustic passages. Their understanding of such acoustic phenomena has been materialist rather than social constructionist. In this way, non-representational geographies of the video game have echoed attention to music elsewhere in non-representational geography. As above, this has frequently invoked philosophers rather than musicologists or musicians to conceptualize music. Thus, Simpson, in his account of timbre, draws again on Jean-Luc Nancy, and specifically Nancy's definition of timbre as, above all, the unity of diversity that its unity does not reabsorb. Elsewhere, Cruz, in a fascinating account, has considered instrumental music through the canon of John Cage, an avant-garde composer whose work is synonymous with a novel but niche challenge to conventional musical form. What non-representational geographies of music in video games and elsewhere have missed is the rich literature of musicology. While reiterating that music has no inherent denitive capacity, musicology, or at least some of it, has traced some of the recurring structural features of music that enable it to communicate information, including geographical. I'll now turn to this literature, considering video game music in particular. Outside of human geography, attention to video game music is nascent but expanding. Ludomusicology, as the field is known, encompasses a series of disciplines, from neurology to psychology, media studies to musicology. Conventionally, the first distillation of academic work is traced to Zach Whalen, who, drawing together accounts by Matthew Belinkie and David Purcell, amongst others, offered an initial agenda for video game music studies. Whalen contended that music was crucial to the semantic operations of a video game. Specifically, via a close reading of how video games' musical cues were received, Whalen suggested that games rely on important cognitive associations between types of music and interpretations of causality, physicality, and character. In other words, video game music orients players within virtual space. Since Whalen's article, a series of authors have expanded on ludomusicology and its aims. Borrowing from film music studies, these accounts have differentiated between diegetic and non-diegetic score, i.e. music within and without the game world. Film music theory is a key reference point for interpreting video game music and is drawn upon extensively by ludomusicology. But there are also differences between films and video games in how music is written and experienced. While video game cutscenes usually follow cinematic scoring principles, video games are not a fully fixed entity. They unfold relative to how the player plays them. Nevertheless, there is often an alignment between locations within the game's virtual world and musical cues, and this is especially so in The Legend of Zelda. While the exact commencement of musical passages may vary, they remain linked to certain locations and characters, tasks, and events. As such, this paper draws on structuralist and semiotic theories within musicology to interpret the Legend of Zelda score, particularly as these have been applied to soundtrack. Crucially, such approaches, rather than creating the stale accounts of video games warned of by Shaw and Wolf, are rooted in meanings and associations for which there is substantial empirical support. While as Hart has stated, no account of video game score can determine exactly the various meanings that will be brought into the musical experience by the player, such added meanings may be incorporated into the set of musical experience potentials already delineated by video game music. For an example, we might consider style. As mentioned, the most popular video game franchises employ scores written in the Western symphonic tradition. In the case of The Legend of Zelda, late Romanticism especially is invoked, which I'll return to momentarily. As such, video game music orients the game player via Western stylistic conventions, familiar to audiences, if not from the classical canon, then from the plenitude of Hollywood score derived from this tradition. Beyond musical style, we might consider musical topics. Musical topics are acoustic shorthands, such as fanfares to signal heroism, so-called hurry music for chases, and jazz to suggest an urban milieu. And they often follow the logic of racial stereotyping, such as the use of Indian music in Westerns. As these examples attest, the key aspect of such topics is their spatial associations, such as with place and landscape. The musicologist Tom Schneller, for example, has examined how particular progressions, such as those employing the subtonic flattened seventh degree, are repeatedly used in Hollywood films to invoke the quality of American nationhood. Given that film score provides the foundation for much video game score, the same technique has been adopted by game makers. Complementing these spatial associations, musical passages are frequently wedded to emotional logics. For example, audience studies show that music in the three major diatonic modes is more strongly associated with positivity than music in the four minor diatonic modes. I'll now turn to think about how all this can be applied to a case study of video game music, and that is The Legend of Zelda. Legend of Zelda is a fusion of Western and Japanese cultural elements, borrowing heavily from both older and more recent European fables, including the Arthurian legends, J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, and Tolkien's Lord of the Rings saga. The series creator, Shigeru Miyamoto, was also inspired by his childhood explorations of local caves and woodlands in Kyoto Prefecture. And the series features enemies reminiscent of the stock villains of Japanese folklore, Oni. Other briefer references are made in the series to Arabic, African, and South Asian cultural elements. By many metrics, the Legend of Zelda series is the most popular in video game history. Ocarina of Time, 1998, is the highest rated game on the leading review aggregator Metacritic, with a score of 99%. Other entries including Majora's Mask, 2000, The Wind Waker, 2002, Twilight Princess, 2006, and Breath of the Wild, 2017, feature in Metacritic's all-time list of the best 100 video games. Together with Skyward Sword, 2011, they represent the 6 three-dimensional entries in the series, i.e. the action on screen appears to exist in 3 dimensions, commonly considered the franchise's flagship titles. These 6 titles also possess the series' most well-developed musical scores. The first of the 6 flagship games, Ocarina of Time, established the main tenets of the series' musical character, while earlier non-flagship entries trialed individual themes, including the main title. Their complexity was limited by technical and budgetary constraints. Ocarina of Time was the first to feature a full score accompaniment. Written by the specialist video game composer Koji Kondo, variations of themes from the Ocarina of Time are featured in all subsequent Legend of Zelda games, which is notable for recycling musical cues. Like the game itself, the score is an amalgam of musical styles, but modeled principally on Western stylistic conventions. The score is performed by an electronic version of a Western symphony orchestra with a harmonic language derived principally from tonal and also from romantic chromatic music. The musical world of The Legend of Zelda, like its fictional setting as a whole, is a hybrid, incorporating traditions as diverse as the Gregorian Chant, Japanese folk music, even Brazilian jazz. In this way, the series' music reflects the global video game industry, a fusion of American and Japanese business cultures. But the central influence on the score of The Legend of Zelda is the Western classical tradition, especially Romanticism, which came to prominence during the 19th century. Romantic music itself includes a plurality of substyles and approaches, but is marked by extended melodic passages, intensified chromaticism, that is the use of notes outside of a piece's primary key, and timbral color. Its instrumentation is lush, often string-led. In Legend of Zelda, these stylistic tenets are found throughout the score, but especially during extended musical passages, such as those that mark Link's travels across Hyrule, such as Hyrule Field. Thus, for Gervais, the 6 teleportation pieces on Ocarina of Time contain harmonic progressions that can be understood and categorized using a mixture of harmonic language from tonal and romantic chromatic music. The depth to Western musical form is evidenced by the titles of these 6 pieces: Bolero of Fire, Minuet of Forest, Nocturne of Shadows, Prelude of Light, Requiem of Spirit, and Serenade of Water. In terms of music, the stylistic backdrop to The Legend of Zelda matches the series setting in a putatively Western, if fictionalized, historical landscape. The Legend of Zelda is not alone in this. In video game score, Western classical styles have become synonymous with epic titles, especially in the domains of fantasy and science fiction. The reasons for this are plural, but lie principally in the history of Hollywood score, the primary inspiration for video game score, where early on the classical, specifically late Romantic style, became synonymous with large budget productions. Today, the highest grossing video game franchises frequently draw from elements of this style, including Assassin's Creed, Final Fantasy, God of War, Halo, Medal of Honor, Metal Gear, The Elder Scrolls, and so forth. Although Romanticism provides The Legend of Zelda with its musical framework, it is not the only Western musical form from which it borrows. The Song of Time, found throughout the series when Link enters or is proximate to the Temple of Time, is performed, as Link describes, by male voices in an unmetered style, suggestive of a Gregorian chant to suggest the sacredness of this location within the game world. Stemming from Jewish musical traditions, the Gregorian chant is the traditional liturgical music of the Catholic Church. It adopted its characteristic form in the 3rd and 4th centuries, was fully developed by the 7th century, and has expanded in the centuries since. Its modern form is much the same as it was 1,000 years ago. The Legend of Zelda scores Christian associations are reinforced elsewhere in the series, from further instances of plain chant in the Breath of the Wild, especially when Link is traversing high sacral spaces such as towers, to church bells that ring in time with the score of the denouement of Ocarina of Time. Elsewhere, the Legend of Zelda series is steeped in other Western musical forms, which nevertheless retain Christian resonance. In Twilight Princess, Midler's Lament is modeled on the lament bass, a tetrachordal ostinato, a repeating motif associated with pain, tears, and lamentation, as right and Sim's note. And we can play Midler's Lament now, so please do say if you can't hear, it should all work. So the lament bass originated during the Baroque period, broadly the early 17th century to the mid 18th century, with famous examples including Dido's Lament by Purcell and the Crucifixus of J.S. Bach's The Minor Mass. What purpose does the series grounding in the Western classical canon serve? The cinematic quality of the score for Legend of Zelda offers one explanation. The film composer, John Williams, whose work has influenced Koji Kondo, has described his approach to scoring the fantastical in these words: "It must speak to some collective memory that we don't quite understand, some memory of Buck Rogers or King Arthur or something earlier in the cultural sorts of our brains, memories of lives lived in the past. It resonates within us in some past hero's life that we've all lived." In other words, a key method of mythologizing events in contemporary popular culture, such as video games, is to root their soundscapes in a historical musical style. This style is familiar to diverse audiences, even if they are unfamiliar with the classical canon, because of its recycling in contemporary cinema and elsewhere. There's this quality of the score for The Legend of Zelda that is referenced by game designer Seth Sivak's analysis of the series. The full moon is slowly dropping towards the horizon as dawn approaches, and a young man in green rides fearlessly across the open plain. Soft music is heard. It feels old and important, ancient even. In this way, the music of The Legend of Zelda is more than an indeterminate effective tool. It situates the listener specifically and geographically. Here we thought about musical style. Now we'll briefly think about musical topics. Musical topics are association-laden units of musical discourse, signifying with consistent, if not universal, meaning. Drawing on the work of Leonard Ratner, Manuel's classic Typology differentiates between musical topics concerning the hunt, the military, and the pastoral. Thus, topic theory is a key tool for those wishing to understand the geographical associations of instrumental music, but one that has yet to be addressed by geographers. While topic theory was developed from the classical canon, it has been increasingly applied to film, television, and video game scores, not least because of their depth to classical forms and conventions. Thus, Lehman has shown how, in films about the American presidency, the soundtrack enlists musical topics and associations, tragedy, Americana, religion, obsession, to invoke and construct a mythicized version of US history. Focusing on the work of John Williams, Lehman shows how Williams himself draws from the musical style of composers such as Aaron Copland, creating a musical discourse of defined specifications. The preponderance of musical topics in popular soundscapes makes them identifiable by audiences. As Tag states, time and again, the average listener viewer has heard particular sorts of music in conjunction with particular sorts of visual message. Through this learning process, certain musical structures become associated with certain themes, such as types of personality and human interaction, objects, social or natural surroundings, gender, nationalities, peoples, professions, historical periods, places, environments, events, animals, etc. If Tag's reference to the average listener seems opaque, we might recall the audience reception studies of Templey and Tan mentioned previously, which show that musical conventions are received in definable ways. Indeed, in The Legend of Zelda, players must detect in-game musical topics and apply them diegetically to complete the game. In this way, the series itself demonstrates the ability of audiences to identify and reproduce musical topics. What are the mechanics of musical topics? Griffith and Makin, after McClary, describe how, traditionally, masculine characters in opera have been represented through harsher staccato notes that might be associated with military music, which conveys liveliness and certainty, whereas women are represented through longer legato, that is flowing articulation, which is more emotionally lingering. Griffith and Makin illustrate these musical topics by the James Bond franchise, which repeatedly uses such topics to represent male and female characters. Elsewhere, Scheurer has described how, in the case of underscoring heroic action, contemporary Hollywood composers often rely on gestures that employ vigorous or driving rhythms, dramatic intervallic leaps, i.e. significant changes in pitch, especially of a fourth or fifth of an octave, or soaring melodic patterns that exploit chords outlining the fifth, or octaves or ascending melodic lines. In other words, the scores accompanying male and female characters in popular culture are not arbitrary, they are often prescribed. In The Legend of Zelda, similar well-established musical topics are employed. Thus, Wyatt has proposed a four-pipe typology for the series, foregrounding the active and emotive. Adventure, marked by syncopated rhythms, which emphasize weak beats and vice versa. Horn calls, open fourths, fifths, a modal mixture. Battle, marked by metric conflict, acceleration of tempo, lack of melodic intervals, and instruments of a lower timbre and or pitch, such as timpani, low horns, and strings. Lament, marked by the lament bass, as we just heard, slow tempos, large melodic intervals, a modal mixture. And heroism, marked by the Dorian mode, a type of minor scale, fast tempos, rhythmic and harmonic acceleration, and counterpoint, a particular relationship between different melodic lines. Musical topics are also used in the series to represent people and place. Each population and locale in the Legend of Zelda series is linked to a dedicated leitmotif or recurrent theme, including the Gorons, the Gerudo, the Kokiri, the Hylians, and the Zora, and Hyrule Castle, Hyrule Field, Lon Lon Ranch, and the various temples that the player must traverse. These leitmotifs are simple, melodic, repeated whenever the player is interacting with these groups or located in these places, a common feature in video games. As musical topics, they draw on elements of these groups or places deemed stereotypical. Thus, in the Temple of Time and Stone Tower Temple, Christianized locations, the theme is played in the style of a Gregorian chant. And we have an example of that here for the Temple of Time. In Lon Lon Ranch, where Link can stable and race horses, a jaunty American Western leitmotif plays. In the Forest Temple, surrounded by Africanized flora and fauna, the track features common African instruments, such as the djembe. And in the home of the Gerudos, who are presented as dark-skinned desert people led by the antagonist Ganon, an amalgam of Spanish, North African, and Arabesque musical forms and instruments are employed. 2 points I think are notable here. First, through musical topics, the score of The Legend of Zelda in dialogue with the visual component of the games presents simplified portrayals of people and place, which serve to orient the player via stereotypes existing outside of its game world. These include the potential nefariousness of unspecified Arabesque societies, the exoticism of African locales, and the synonymity of Christianity with morality. In this way, the series might be situated with the array of work that is considered visual but not musical, ethnic and regional stereotypes in gaming, including the often limited depictions of non-Japanese characters in Japanese video games. Second, and going beyond pre-existing musical topics, the series creates its own associations between instrumental music and in-game space. To return to the discussion at the head of this paper, video games not only incorporate representations of landscape, they are themselves a form of landscape representation. Indeed, it is crucial to successful gameplay in The Legend of Zelda that the player appreciates these in-game musical topics and is able to reproduce them, making landscape in the series performative. In Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and Skyward Sword, the memorization of musical refrains associated with certain places is required to access particular locations and to progress. For example, Zelda's Lullaby, used in almost every Legend of Zelda game, is employed at various points to open the royal family's tomb and to teleport Link through time. In form, it is written in the gentle and regular rhythm of the lullaby, or form legato, but it also has a strictly in-game purpose. In this way, it is a musical topic that refers to geographical elements, both internal and external, to the Legend of Zelda game world. So I'll finish now just with a couple of remarks by way of conclusion. As I hope this paper has shown, video game score is a rich source for reflecting on how space is represented and constituted by instrumental music. Methodologically, this research has sought to bring such score to the attention of geographers. Conceptually, it has had two aims. First, it has sought to show how instrumental music, not just lyrical music, acts as a socio-spatial ordering device. In this way, it seeks to broaden understandings of music in geography to incorporate a fuller definition of musicality. Second, it has sought to show how non-representational accounts of video games and music, while offering engaging ways of understanding both, have nevertheless overlooked the structural features of music as delineated by research in musicology, especially musical semiotics. Recurring phenomena, like musical styles and topics, do not mean that all audiences appreciate music in the same way, but they do suggest that non-representational geographies construed of music as indeterminate might be enriched by greater attention to the work of musicologists and music scholars. This research is only a first step, of course. Future work on video game score and other kinds of music will hopefully continue the analysis of instrumental music presented here. One avenue of inquiry might consider how musical timbre evokes spatial and temporal dimensions. For example, the instruments that reverberate are often employed to communicate a sense of expansive space and scale. Acoustically, they emulate the way that sound echoes in cavernous environments. Another avenue of inquiry might look at how spatial and temporal dynamics are conveyed not only by musical instrumentation, but by musical form at the most granular scale. The music theorist Kofi Agawu, for example, has explored the themes of home, progress, and return, and the ways in which these are implicated in the musical structure of Western Romantic music. Elsewhere, Flynn has described how tonality, for instance, always returns home to the tonal center of the piece. It also preserves the sanctity of this home by expelling foreign elements, such as grammaticism, or by domesticating those few that are allowed to remain. So in this way, musical form itself is involved in the formation of geographical worlds. So, thank you for listening. I'll stop there. And with that, I'd be pleased to take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Philip. It's absolutely fascinating. Makes me want to game again as well. So do we have any questions from the floor, the virtual floor, the digital floor, to start our discussion of Phil's paper? Let's see if there's any. You can either stick your hand up through the reactions, or you can just come on camera and or microphone. Nothing at the moment. Okay, I'll take chair's privilege then. Phil, I was just wondering if you in your research you came across how the fans of the game, given the popularity of this franchise, did you say 19 titles now, is it? That's
right, yeah.
Yeah. How they relate to this music. Has any research been done about how they relate to it? And I wonder what struck me was, you know, the clip you showed of the sort of choral music as in I don't remember the name of the actual space, but sort of a church-like environment, you know, to the topic of that was very sort of almost 8-bit sort of style synthesizer version of a choral. And I'm guessing you can tell me, that was an earlier version of Zelda, one of the earlier ones. And I'm just wondering is there a sort of fan culture towards the music that has changed over that long duration of the amount of titles in the Zelda franchise, as it were?
Yeah, that's a good question, Julie. Yeah, so that piece that we heard, that's from Ocarina of Time, which I think was released about 1998. So it would have all been saved on the game on those MIDI files or very poor quality musical digital files. So it has to be a very kind of low resolution. In terms of kind of fan cultures in this area, I can only really offer kind of anecdotal observations here. I mean, if we were to look at the comments under those videos, those YouTube videos, you would see a lot of kind of reminiscing from people probably of my age and their mid-30s who played these games when they were teenagers, kind of taking them back to that kind of youthful period. So there's something there about kind of video game music and nostalgia, I think. I mean, in terms of the popularity of these pieces themselves, I mean, Spotify has several playlists devoted to video games. They get a lot of hits on YouTube, as I mentioned. Video game music is increasingly popular in the repertoires of otherwise classically orientated Western orchestras. And I suppose for traditionalists, that's a bit of a sellout, has been seen as a bit of a sellout. But one of the reasons orchestras have done that is because it's so popular and because they can get high attendance at their concerts when they play video game scores. So I think to some commentators at least, Western orchestras kind of pivoting towards video game music and indeed film music has been one way to kind of ensure their survival in a world where kind of interesting classical music has been slowly declining. So I think there is a big market for listening to these types of scores, but I'm not sure if there's been any kind of concerted research that's really tried to unpack that yet.
Can you get the example? The orchestras doing scores from which video games? I've never heard of that before myself.
So this is a very popular one. So Zelda is a very popular one.
Right, yeah, obviously.
As I think I mentioned, some games, Fable, for example, they actually have kind of noted film composers, Danny Elfman in that case, who produced the scores for them. So it becomes a bit of a, I suppose, self-perpetuating thing, which is that the bigger games get these kind of very grand scores by film composers, and those scores become popular, but also the games are being played by millions of players. So they're kind of entering the popular consciousness that way too. But yeah, Zelda is definitely one of the more famous. I think possibly because music is actually integrated into the game itself. You have to play the music as a player to complete certain objectives. So often I think it's Zelda that is the basis for a lot of the repertoires of video game music played by classical orchestras.
Exactly, and I thought the other question I was going to ask is it quite unusual in video games for the to achieve a certain task to play music? I thought it makes Zelda a particularly good example to do, doesn't it? I guess I can't think of, and again, I'm not a gamer. I won't try and claim that remotely, but nothing comes to mind where you have to play other than obvious guitar, like Guitar, what was it called? Guitar Hero? That was it, wasn't it? Where you actually have to play music that is the game sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I can't think of any that are certainly kind of have music as well integrated into, or the performance of music as well integrated into the narrative as the Zelda games. And not all of the Zelda games do. Ocarina of Time is particularly notable for doing that.
Ocarina, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting way to try and engage with the kind of the game world and the game space. And I think Nintendo, when they released Ocarina of Time, did release a kind of limited edition miniature ocarina, which you could actually play the music on and plug straight into your N64.
Wow.
It does seem one of the kind of exceptions to in the video game kind of space.
I can imagine they're well sought after now. Those for hardcore fans.
Collector's item now, I'm sure.
Yeah. Demand stupid money. Any questions from anybody out there in the digital realm? I've got loads, but I don't want to hog it. Susan, you've come on camera, so I'm guessing.
I'm just coming out. It's not really a question, but it's just to kind of go on that theme. This idea of musical objects within the game, are they associated with different landscapes and different places and different settings, or is it a bit random whether somebody kind of uses a harp or the flute that comes through? I don't play the game, so I'm not sure of that setting. So I'm just wondering whether a user's musical knowledge is associated with particular kinds of settings, do you think?
Yeah, so well, different areas of the kind of the Ocarina of Time world are very much associated with particular kind of musical refrains and leitmotifs. And as you walk into that area, the background music will start to play a version of that music. And then there'll probably be somewhere within that location where you'll have to perform the kind of melody on your ocarina to progress in some way. So there is certainly in that game a very kind of tight kind of connection between particular spaces and particular types of music. And it has been done with a relatively high degree of care, I think. So again, we just saw the kind of Gregorian chants that you experience in kind of church and sacred spaces, and the kind of Western music that you find in the ranch environment in that game, and so on and so forth. So there is kind of a tight connection between place and music, certainly in that game. I mean, in terms of the ability of you as the player to understand music, that's fairly limited. You have to memorize kind of 5 or 6 musical note passage, which is usually the first couple of bars of the melody. And obviously you can write that down if you can't remember it, or you can memorize the keys on the controller rather than the musical notes itself. But it does require engagement and listening. You couldn't play the game on mute, for example, like some games that you might be able to play without the sound on. You have to engage with the music to progress through the narrative.
Thanks, that's really interesting. Thanks.
Is there just on what I'm fascinated by what you're doing here, Phil, is bringing musicology, I mean, specifically into sort of human geography. And I wonder, and I'm maybe not the person to answer this in some ways, but I wonder if there is a sort of almost a fear of going into that sort of thing. I say this, I mean, I don't know if it is equivalent, but what reminded me of, I used to do obviously work on religion, geographies of religion, and there was a real reluctance for people to engage in theology. You know, and despite the fact a lot of theologians were talking about space, place, and you know, all the sort of things that geographers of religion were very interested in. I wonder I mean, you obviously have a good knowledge of musicology to understand this. Is there a thing about people say, well, I can't read music, I can't look at musicology? Do you think it's like that? And yourself, you seem, you know, you're talking about modes and various diachronic scales and things like that. You know, have you got training personally in that? And I wonder what has that helped you negotiate that sort of barrier, if we can call it that, or that divide?
Yeah, that's a good point and an interesting one. And I think there has been very little geographical work that's engaged with musicology. I mean, my personal experiences, I suppose I have a kind of serious amateur interest in music, so I understand some of that kind of jargon when it comes to musicological language, but I can't claim any kind of particular expertise. It's enough to kind of mediate between the two disciplines in that sense. And it will also be interesting to know how kind of musicologists interpret kind of social scientists writing about music too. Yes. But yeah, I mean, it's not a dialogue that really exists. I'm not aware of there being very much geography that has really sought to engage with musicology. I think there have been certain agendas that have tried to be started by writers such as Jazil, who have said we should, if we're interested in music, we should probably be talking more to music theorists and musicologists. But I don't think that has really been achieved, probably because, as you say, there is a kind of wariness of some of the jargon in that, and because you probably need a little bit of training to engage with some of that literature. And it may be the case that, certainly from some people in musicology, there's a bit of sniffiness about social scientists and sociologists and geographers working on music, often in not the most kind of complex and sophisticated way, certainly for a musicologist. But well, we'll see. Hopefully there'll be an increasing dialogue between the two disciplines. But yeah, there is a large gap there to be bridged, I think.
And I mean, there's the what sociologists, geographers, etc., could bring to the party, as it were, for want of a better phrase, is that criticality. Because I noted you still had the way in which these, as you said, the topics and the styles still very much reproduce, very much, you know, taken for granted stereotypes of a nation's almost national identity in some ways, you know, of a nation as a space and their music. You know, it has to be this because it's from this place, or we're in this type of environment, you're walking through this environment, so therefore it must be this.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. So I think, as you might imagine, yeah, people working on music in the more kind of social sciences are often interested in kind of referentiality and the extra musical. So what is this musical passage symbolizing, or what might it be symbolizing? Whereas there are a lot of music theorists that are really just interested in the kind of the structure of the music itself and the sophistication of the musical form, and are much less interested in what that might symbolize in a kind of broader context. And possibly might even think that such criticism almost kind of sullies the music in a sense, especially if you're talking about a very complex and sophisticated musical patterning. When you simply reduce it to, well, what might this be connected to? What might it symbolize? You're taking away from the music and the interest of the music, and diverting attention elsewhere. There's probably a little bit of that from the kind of perspective of many musicologists too, which again I think speaks to this gap between the two approaches. And yeah, I'm not sure how much that gap can be narrowed. But I think it's important to at least try, and I think that certainly geographers who work on music could learn a great deal by kind of closer engagement with musicology.
I think that's what's brilliant about your work, and particularly this paper today, is that you are bridging that gap. You're bringing that language, that musicology language, to another discipline, both geography and obviously sociology and cultural studies, whatever. But at the same time, you're not losing that criticality, and it's not just about the very technical elements of the modes and all those sort of things. It's still aware of those wider implications and consequences in terms of, I guess, social cultural politics, isn't it? So that's really, that's definitely what attracted me to your work. Are there any other questions or comments indeed from anybody else out there? This is the problem with the digital. You can't look into somebody's eyes to prompt them to kind of like, ask a question, etc. Because I go, oh, Susan was coming back. No, she wasn't.
Not a question, but I just wanted to make a comment on behalf of a number of our PGRs who are at a PGR conference today. So they've sent their apologies, and they will be catching up with the recording afterwards. So just to let you know that there were several people who were keen on coming along to this today as well.
That's why we wanted to do the recording in particular, wasn't it? So these guys can see it. I've got one final sort of thought. I was thinking about, another concept that has been introduced a lot, particularly non-representational geographies, and one that I think really resonates with music is the notion of atmosphere. The way in which atmosphere has been discussed in human geography and elsewhere, obviously. I'm trying not to make it too geographical focused, but isn't music, and particularly in video games, it's all about atmosphere, creating that atmosphere of a space. And I immediately think, whenever I think of a video game and I think about music and or sound, I think of Silent Hill. For me, the most affective, with an A, impact of and register of that game was the sound. It was the creepy, and it was the atmospherics of it. Don't know, that's just more of a comment, Phil. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
No, I think that's a good point. And the music for The Legend of Zelda is very kind of connotative in many ways. It really has very kind of close associations between the music itself and what it's trying to kind of stimulate, I think, in the listener's mind. And it does that through kind of musical conventions and the musical topics and the kind of almost kind of musical stereotypes that we've been discussing here. And there is certainly more kind of affective music, I think, for many video games, which is slightly less interested in actually kind of eliciting a very clear image in the listener's mind than just creating a certain kind of feeling as you're moving through a particular kind of space. I think probably even that kind of music, on close examination, you would find that it's still using a lot of techniques that are well established for making those associations, and it's likely to be very kind of intertextual in that it's probably doing that in a way that other music has done previously, and that's why it's meaningful to the listener. So that's why in the paper I think I'm a little bit reticent to kind of fully get on board with the kind of non-representational perspective on music as a elusive and kind of indeterminate kind of entity. I don't think much music is like that, and I think kind of the more you scrutinize it, the more you see that there are these associations. But as you say, there is certainly music which is less kind of clearly connoting a particular kind of extra musical idea than other music, and that would definitely be an interesting type of video game music to be explored by geographers in the future, I think.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Phil. Brilliant. Any further questions or comments before we finish off? I want to make sure I don't shut anybody up, as it were. Doesn't look like it. So, but that was fantastic, Phil. Thank you so much for taking the time out to do that and joining us with that fascinating paper. Thanks to everybody that's come along. Just to advertise that we have the final, I believe, Mass Manchester. Now, I would normally say webinar, but it's actually going to be a seminar. Hopefully, we're going to do it hybrid. It's going to be broadcast online next week. Next week, I believe at 1 o'clock, 26th of May, we've got Leslie McMurty from University of Salford, who will be talking about digital horror podcasting. So finishing off our digital geography, digital sounds sort of virtual spaces seminar, webinar series that we've been holding in 21-22. So, and that's being held in Jeffrey Manton Building, room 235 next week. So just a quick advert for that. So thanks very much, everybody, for coming, and thanks very much, Phil. There you go.